Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder, and I have a special guest today, Richard Landis, a historian, a millennialist, an intellectual who now lives in Israel, and he's in the same quarantine situation we all are in. Hi, Richard. How you doing?
Fine. Not a millennialist. I'm a student of millennialism.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Okay, that's true.
That's right.
That's a good point.
In my entire career. In fact, my professor once sent me a document, and he said, "Not being a millennialist, I don't understand this, but I think it might interest you."
That's true. You're not. Yeah, you're right. You're not a vanilla. You're not one of the crazies. This is a good point.
Actually, quite the contrary. Studying millennialism has, to some extent, inoculated me against it.
Okay, that's probably true. Yeah, and it's an interesting topic, certainly. We wanted to just to start off. I mean, for the past 20 years at least. I'm not familiar with you too much before that, but you've been in the forefront of exposing the really the crazy hypocrisy that comes out there, the how Westerners are so willing to give in to Islamist thought and philosophy, just in the interests of peace or in the very misjudged interests of peace. Can you just go into that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, I've given it a term which takes it back exactly 20 years. I call it Y2K mind. Y2K being the year 2000. Y2K bug was about the computer glitch, which turned out not to be a serious problem. But it turns out that in the year 2000, we had the first assault, a direct jihadi assault on a democracy. And the response on the part of Western thought leaders, by and large progressives, who really dominate the sort of public sphere in the West, was to blame the democracy. And here I'm talking about the Intifada and what I call the Oslo Jihad against Israel. And as a result, in particular, of the Mohammed Abdullah affair, the story of the 12-year-old boy behind the barrel at Netzarim Junction, who was allegedly, according to Charles Aldelin, a Western Israeli journalist, gunned down in cold blood by the IDF. He didn't say in cold blood, his cameraman did.
Yeah.
But he said that the boy was the target of fire from the Israeli position, for which he had no evidence whatsoever. He wasn't there, etc. In any case, the story ended up becoming I call it a postmodern blood libel. And partly as a result of that, but partly as a result of just the media having been primed with this sort of Israeli Goliath, Palestinian David image, or what the journalists call a nut. That was the nut of their story. They proceeded to tell the story of this vicious suicide terror attack campaign against Israel as being Israel's fault. And if only Israel had been nicer, then everything would have been fine. And a year later, when there was 9/11, although it didn't happen as quickly with the United States, certainly inside the United States, as it happened in the West in response to the Israeli case, you had a response that basically said, you know, America deserved it. And we all know the sermon given by Reverend Wright, Obama's reverend,
yes,
who said, you know, it's America's roosters coming home to roost. And I've written a book about this, and it goes way beyond just Reverend Wright and that particular circle. Throughout academia, there was a tremendous hostility to America. And so I define Y2K mind as when jihadis attack a democracy, blame the democracy. And that's become, it has, over the last 20 years, really come to dominate a whole range of thought, which now since 2016 is associated with anti-Trumpism as well.
Yeah.
So you have this. Yeah, I mean, I think we really have a terrible situation in the West where people have stopped thinking or are unable to think clearly. Because of so many derangement disorders, whether it's Israel derangement disorder or Trump derangement disorder or before him Obama derangement disorder, people really are driven by these kinds of derangements that I think in many cases are not the product of thinking but the product of fear.
And that's no, and I understand you. I mean, would you say, again, not to get too far off on this? I mean, would you say that the Al-Dura affair was really the beginning of this, or you? I mean, I would think that this people have been blaming Israel for everything since before 1948.
Right. No, there's no question that there's always been an anti-Israel voice. And I remember I was in my my then wife, was teaching at Berkeley. I was writing my thesis in 1982, and I lost a year on my thesis because I went to Sproul Plaza every day to argue with a group called CAFIOT, Committee for Academic Freedom in the Israel-Occupied Territories. And I asked them, where's their academic freedom in the rest of the Arab world? And, their response was, don't change the subject. But the point that I'd make is that while that kind of discourse has been around for a long time, with the Al-Dura affair, it went mainstream. With the Al-Dura affair, it became extremely difficult for anybody defending Zionism to speak out. And so, there's a Pakistani professor at UMass who wrote a thing on sort of the Palestinian narrative of suffering, which is what he called it. Mm-hmm. And one of the points that he made was, a couple of years ago, I couldn't have said this. Now, this is the dominant motif.
Yeah, narrative.
And the dominant narrative, right. And there really was a kind of radical switch. So something that had been relatively marginal to sort of the extreme left, mm-hmm. the radical left, all of a sudden went mainstream. So it was now possible to compare Israel to the Nazis, which before 2000, not too many people did and maintained any credibility. After that, you've got Jose Saramago, you got a whole bunch of people who are comparing Israel to the Nazis, and you can trace it directly to the Al-Dura thing. There's this really centrist, if not sort of right-wing in France, that's called liberal, journalist named Catherine Ney, who said, this picture of the boy replaces the picture of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. Yes. So, the Al-Dura affair was a sort of get-out-of-Holocaust shame-free card mm-hmm. for Europe. And what they didn't realize was that by embracing this narrative, which made them feel better, they were actually empowering the jihadis.
Yes, absolutely. And that's and again, a lot of the stuff that you've been dealing with since then, and I know the project that you're working on now is to try to almost like shake the world by their shoulders and say, listen, we got some really, really big problems here that people are too scared to talk about, namely the jihadi threat, the Islamist threat. Can you tell me a little bit about, I know that you've been writing a book, or you have written a book about this, but you're having some issues. So can you talk about that?
Right. So I wrote a book, and the whole time I wrote it, and by the way, it's not easy. It's not easy to write a history of your own times. My Skype tag name is Rodolphus Glaber, who is a historian who wrote a history of his time at the turn of the year 1000. So he's sort of my model. So it was hard, and it took me about a decade to do it. And now I can't publish it. And all that time I called it, they're so smart because we're so stupid. And I took that from the Al-Dura affair because the Al-Dura footage is crap. Any serious person looking at this who hadn't already been, cued in to what he was supposed to be seeing would look at it and say, what is this? How can you possibly tell this story based on this evidence?
Yeah.
And then the closer you look at it, the worse it gets. So
if I'm not mistaken, you're the one that created the term Pallywood, right?
Yes, and I did because I was looking at the footage that this cameraman shot with Charles Aldelin, the guy who ran the story according to this Palestinian cameraman's narrative. And we're looking at it, and it's filled with fakes, one after another. And at one point I said, but Charles, all this is fake. He says, oh, yeah, they do that all the time.
Right. and we've seen that. I mean, there was a... it took me a little while to find, but I remember there was a scene of, a picture showing that, an Israeli soldier like stepping on a Palestinian schoolgirl or something like that. And I looked, I said, I bet this is street theater. I mean, I just looked at it. It just makes no sense. It's not the real soldier, not this. And then finally I found an actual picture showing that exact same scene with everybody around it, crowded around in, I forget which country it was, in Iraq or something. It was
Israel, right?
No, it wasn't even close, and but it's like, and it's being, and there's so many examples of Pallywood that happens, So the that affair was just the beginning of it, but it was like it happens all the time, and we see especially with Twitter, and
Right.
anybody can just post whatever they want to from Syria or anywhere.
Right. And people would say to me, yeah, but they're so brilliant in their PR, and we're so stupid. And my response was, they're not brilliant. We're stupid. They're only brilliant because we're so stupid. Because we buy this stuff. And because we and when I say we, I mean the West, sort of my colleagues at the university. I tried to talk to one of them. I showed him my movie about Pallywood, and he said, I don't think that you're up to date. I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm not on your side anymore.
But I think that part of it is because there's just, in the West, the idea that somebody is lying to your face,
yes,
it just cannot be. It's not something they can even wrap their arms around. Is that somebody's actually lying to me? There has to be some truth to it. They can't,
right.
They're spinning it or something. But the basic thing is true.
So I have a chapter. I have 4 chapters that are the historical basis of the book. One on Adula, one on responses to 9/11, one on the Jenin massacre, and one on the Danish cartoon scandal. But in the one on Jenin, here you've got for 19 days the Israelis are attacking this 5-block area within the Jenin refugee camp. And the media is not allowed in. Meantime, the Palestinian media is running stories about, massacres and mass graves and, all this sort of Nazi-like accusations. Mm-hmm. And the media, the Western media, is running this as if it's true. And at one point, Andrea Koppel, who is the daughter of, what's his name?
I remember that for Ted Koppel.
Yeah, Ted Koppel. So his daughter, and she's working for CNN, and she shows up, and she's confronted by an American Israeli, who says to her, she's talking about massacre and stuff. He said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, you've been massacring the Palestinians. And he said, where did you hear this from? And she said, from my colleagues. And he said, where did they hear it from? And she said, from the Palestinians. And he said, does it ever occur to you that Palestinians are lying to you? And her response is really telling, and I spent a couple of paragraphs going into it. She said, oh, so they're all liars now.
Right, exactly. And it's... That's
right.
True.
So essentially what she's saying is, I feel obliged to virtue signal my lack of prejudice against
right, yes.
And it shouldn't be prejudice. There's plenty of evidence for their lying. I virtue signal by making myself a principled dupe.
Yeah, that's true. But it's been, I saw it again. I followed very carefully because I was blogging heavily by this point by the 2009 war and the 2012 and everything. The so many times in which the eyewitnesses would be on the news and say, here's what happened. It was an Israeli bomb, and then we would find out it really wasn't. And even if not the Middle East people from like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, but even the ones that aren't would say, we know that witnesses are unreliable. We can't rely on them. But of course, nobody thinks that in terms of the Palestinians.
Well, I remember at one point, Tom Segeb came to Boston. I was still teaching at Boston University and living in Brookline, and he came to Boston, and they had and him and Saib Erekat to discuss the Middle East situation. So I called up because I had some contacts there, and I said, what are you doing? You've got a left-wing Israeli, highly self-critical, and a guy who is a proven liar, who was one of the major purveyors of the Jenin lie. And they said, well, it's pretty thin picking on that side.
I'll go off on a slight aside over here because since you brought up Erekat, and since today is Easter, I have an article that I wrote today that there was an Easter message from Saib Erekat,
Right.
in which he said, and you would think there's never every message from them is obviously political. There's never going to say, "Hey, happy Easter, everybody," or "Hey, we're all together. We're all in this together for the coronavirus. Let's work on it." Nothing. It's going to be an anti-Israel message. That's not even a question. So he said, the use of religion, holy books, and religious arguments to justify hatred, violations, and war crimes goes against the tradition enshrined in the values of those religions, talking about the three monotheistic religions. The Holy Bible that teaches love has been used by the Israeli and U.S. officials to justify oppression against the land and the people of Palestine. And those who believe in humanity, and particularly those who celebrate the message of love and hope, cannot but denounce such acts. So here's Saib Erekat saying that the people that are twisting scripture to weaponize it against the other people are the Zionists.
So this brings up an interesting phenomenon, which is a part and parcel of what I call Y2K mind, which is this phenomenon of if you point out that other people hate, that makes you a hate monger.
Yeah.
So I have a friend who was actually the first person when I was here in Israel in 1994-95 on a sabbatical. I met a scholar at that point, a graduate student named David Cook, who eventually wrote a book on called Contemporary Islamic Apocalyptic Thought. I think that's the title of it. In any case, so he was the first one to introduce me to apocalyptic thought in Islam, which, interestingly enough, back in the 1990s, considered 2000 to be an apocalyptic date. And what happened was he wrote this book, and he told me that, reading these sources, it was so awful that at the end of the day he just had to take a shower because there was just so much hatred in these apocalyptic sources, which are utterly genocidal about the Jews and so on and so forth. Okay, so he writes this book and he can't get it published. Why? He sends it to a publisher and the reader writes back, "This is hate speech." And that's the first time I understood that for some people, pointing out hate speech is hate speech. The people who actually engage in the hate speech
Of
don't
course.
see anything about
But
that.
it goes, it's only one way. In other words, what we're seeing nowadays is that, the people they don't like, and it's going to be Zionists or Westerners or something like that, they're going to say, well, you're racist.
Right.
But it's not hate speech to call somebody racist, even though it's the biggest insult in their entire catalog of insults.
Exactly.
But that's not hate speech. But it's like, but because we're the ones that are obviously the haters, because we're the racists by their definition.
So I saw something about there's going to be a podcast, I think today, with Noura Erakat and somebody else
Yeah.
about the 75 resolution about Zionism being racism. And, here they are. They're going to be reviving this revolting piece of propaganda against Zionism, which incidentally played a major role in inspiring Edward Said's Orientalism. He actually wrote an article based on that in 1976, which was the sort of foundation of what Orientalism was about. And here they are, they're going to be saying, look at Zionism, it's disgusting, it's racist, whereas they're the racists.
And it's completely insane. I did a little bit of a thread today that I'm probably going to turn into an article, which a Twitter thread, only because there's just stuff that came to me over the holiday, in which I was just saying, the for anti-Semitism, they say, and there's a number of people say, okay, the response for Jews has to be pride. But I think we have to turn that around also and say for anti-Zionists, we have to shame them. Have to show them that what they're thinking is shameful. So I just came up with a bunch of tiny, vignettes saying, anti-Zionists should be ashamed. They should be ashamed that while they pretend to be tolerant, they cannot tolerate a Jewish state. Right. They should be ashamed that when they pretend to be liberal, they support the most illiberal Arab politicians. They should be ashamed on the very holiday where Jews celebrate their freedom from oppressors, they want Jews to go back into exile. They should be ashamed that they claim to want people to be free, but they're against self-determination of only one people. They should be ashamed they claim to be against anti-Semitism, but they publicly and proudly support the world's worst anti-Semites. They pretend to hate racism, but in fact they hate people, and they justify that bigotry by labeling their opponents as racist. Right. They should be ashamed that their supposed love for Arabs and Muslims disintegrates past Israel's borders. Their arguments against Arabs or against Zionists.
Right. In other words, Palestinians in Lebanon and Syria can be treated atrociously. And crickets.
And any Palestinian on the planet would prefer to be in Gaza than to be in Beirut.
Right.
Not even a question.
To be in Israel than any of those places.
Right. And I wrote an article about that too. I said, okay, how many articles have been out there talking about how terrible coronavirus is going to be in Gaza and anticipating it and how Israel's not going to help and all this stuff. Of course, the safest place in the world right now is Gaza and the West, for the coronavirus. But that's what they were saying. And I said, who's talking about the truly overcrowded camps in Lebanon? The crowd, the per square foot number of people is far higher in these camps. They're not allowed to build. They don't have medical facilities. They have nothing. And nobody's worried about the spread of coronavirus over there.
And that's not to mention the millions of refugees that have been made recently, which is a vastly greater Nakba than anything that happened in 49. So your list reminded me of something that one of the words that I and my friends coined after 9/11 was demopath. And it was inspired by the story that this guy told that he actually was a woman. She was in the Department of Agriculture, and Mohammed Atta came to her and wanted a $600,000 loan to buy a crop duster with giant tanks. Okay. And he was planning on using it to fly over a city and
poison everybody.
And poison everybody. And she refused it because he wasn't an American citizen. And his response was to call her a racist.
Of course.
And so I said to my friends, what's the term for somebody who uses the language of democracy and human rights and all those good liberal progressive values in order to undermine them? Mm-hmm. And so a friend of mine came up with the term demopath, which I think is really good. And I think, basically what we see is that there are dupes of demopaths, which is the people who buy this and think that they're sincere, the people who think that Linda Sarsour is, a good person and a good feminist. And then there are the people who are like Linda Sarsour are actually demopaths. And one of the most recent ones is this woman, Hind Hudari,
yes,
who just denounced peace activist in Gaza and tweeted, to 3 Hamas members that they should, stop this normalization. So an organization like Amnesty International, which was supposed to be precisely for all of these human rights values, has now become a major source of demopathy.
It was very interesting because if you look at her, and I wrote about it this morning, but I didn't go into her later reactions, and I can't bring it up on the screen right now, but she's like astonished that people are upset at her. She's truly, she does not get it at all. She's like thinking that, hey, first of all, there was one person from Amnesty who actually had a little bit of morality. She was on one of his mailing lists, and he kicked her off, and he said, what you're doing is just unconscionable.
It's the Vulture Group, and Gerald Steinberg's written about that. Yeah. You should interview Gerald about the Vulture.
Right. But I heard he's not the greatest guy either. I understand. But she wrote back and she said, "You're telling me that being against normalization is wrong," and and then it's like, and she just can't get, she's telling, and I had one line in my article that that was copied. Petra actually copied it. I said a person who was working for an organization that was founded to fight for the freedom of people in prison for free speech demanded that a terror group put people in prison for talking to Israelis. And she just, I mean, her cluelessness is more telling than anything else. She's like, of course, this is part of human rights, because she grew up saying hating Israel is what human rights is.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So now this reminds me of something else that I saw, and I haven't seen any follow-up on it yet, but I'd be interested, which is that when the shutdown came in and teaching moved online, there were a number of professors who were worried that if their teaching were recorded and publicized, they'd be in trouble, because they'd basically been, propagandizing false information to their students, poisonous stuff, particularly about Israel, but also about the United States and the West, and blah, blah, blah. And now they're worried that outsiders are going to hear it. And part of what happened to this woman, Kudari, is that, she lives in a world where this is perfectly normal behavior.
Of course.
She has no idea that in a larger framework, this looks terrible.
No, I understand. And I'm not sure. I don't know if this is going to get to that larger framework, because everybody saw this in the New York Times, but unfortunately David Halbinger, who wrote it, didn't realize that she was an Amnesty. That she worked for Amnesty. He just called her a freelance journalist. And it was when people picked up on that, hey, I've heard of this person, and looked up, David Collier had a bunch of stuff on her from last year. So only when they put that together, it was like, whoa, she's Amnesty. And but again, as I said, I don't think she can tell the difference, because the so-called human rights groups have been so single-mindedly anti-Israel. She cannot tell the difference between human rights and anti-Israel. And it's truly insane. But I don't think there's going to be so much of a. She doesn't get it. I don't think there's going to be any sort of a real backlash against her. I mean, Amnesty might get rid of her, but
there is a petition up for calling on Amnesty to get rid of her, which I recommend everybody sign. I tweeted about it after I signed it. There was a petition, but there was a very interesting exchange that I and a number of people had with Gerald Steinberg today about at what point did these, and I think it might have been sparked by your comment. No, your comment came later, but at what point did these human rights organizations get hijacked? Mm-hmm. And I think the general picture is that starting with the fall of the Soviet Union, they sort of lost their raison d'etre. And started casting around, and at this point, the kind of post-colonial voice, which had been ripening for a decade since 1979, and Orientalism, came in, and over the course of the 90s, built up, and then with the Adur affair, and specifically at Durban, that's a sort of turning point at which these human rights organizations became essentially post-colonial anti-Western organizations.
Well, I'm sure that there's the times I've read about it, and there are a couple of people who have written about the specific Soviet anti-Israel propaganda that started in the 70s. If you read it now, it is identical. I mean, it's completely identical to the stuff that's coming out from the far left and even the regular left today.
Not even the far left, the regular left, which makes you wonder about the intelligence of people.
It's true. No, 100. That's for sure true. But there are people that are like, they're going along with the crowd. They figure it's, if there's smoke, there must be fire. There's all that sort of thing. And but again, I was just reading again over Pesach. I was reading, and I'm about to do a review of it actually. The Jonathan Sacks Haggadah. Instead of reading it from right to left, if you go from left to right, he has a book length. He has so many essays there.
Essays.
It's tremendous essays, fantastic. And he goes over anti-Semitism and stuff like that, and he goes very detailed. The Enlightenment was supposed to be the end of anti-Semitism, and it was the worst people in anti-Semitism were the philosophers, and Voltaire and Kant. They were the worst, and they were the ones that were supposed to be the, getting rid of the old Christian stuff.
Well, weren't the worst.
Okay,
but
right.
We had higher expectations of them.
Right, exactly. But it's like, so being an intellectual does not inoculate you at all. In fact, it could give you, you feel like, oh, I'm hot stuff, therefore what I'm saying is right, and it gives you license for your own
By the way,
prejudice.
an excellent book on this is David Nierenberg's. I forget the name of it.
Was that the anti-Judaism book, or is that who?
Anti-Judaism, right? And
Yeah,
it's really good because he points out that so many intellectuals define themselves as good in opposition to Jews being bad.
right.
That
Yeah,
Jesus was bad by definition, and we were good by, on the one hand, culturally appropriating all kinds of things from them,
yes.
and then on the other hand, trashing them.
And it's so being smart, or being or knowing your stuff, even being informed, is not at all an inoculation against anti-Semitism, which is a
Yeah,
scary thought.
scary thought. In my book, I talk about two kinds of disorientation. Empirical disorientation and moral disorientation. So empirical disorientation is looking at the footage of Aldora and thinking it's about the deliberate killing of a boy. Moral disorientation is saying this image replaces the picture of the
Yeah.
boy in the Warsaw Ghetto, which symbolizes the systematic murder of a million kids.
Right. It's no, yeah, but again, it's a never-ending thing because we see it literally every day, and and again, I don't think, and it's okay. Clearly, the Holocaust didn't, and that sort of like put a pause on it, and it didn't end it. Things are Anti-Semitism is coming back with a vengeance. They'll call it anti-Zionism or anti-Israel or whatever they want to call it, but it's the same hate. It's the psychologically, there's no difference between the two, and it's like I don't see. And the Jews just like to argue. We like to say, well, we'll argue it out and we'll show that we're right, and that just doesn't work.
Right, right. No, so there's a joke. I think it's traced back. I haven't actually seen it in his name, but it's allegedly Isaiah Berlin said, the definition of anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than absolutely necessary. So that's the 20th century definition. The 21st century definition is hating Jews even though it hurts you. Because what's so astonishing about the anti-Zionism and the hatred of autonomous Jews that is so prevalent in the West is that it empowers their worst enemies. So that, a lot of people say, it only starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. But that takes a while. I mean, in my period, in 1010, the Jews are massacred. And in 1022, 12 years later, Christian heretics are burned for the first time in the West. First execution of heretics in the West. So it took there's a 12-year lag. But here, it's like not even.
Sure.
The lag is infinitesimal.
Yep.
Between Adula and 9/11, and yet it doesn't sink in. So
9/11 was like literally days after Durban, right? I mean, it was literally like a couple days after.
days after Durban. Durban ends on September 8th,
Hmm.
and I say in the book, it's not like Bin Laden planned this as a result of Durban, but he believed that when he did it, he would be treated as a hero throughout the world because of Durban. And sure enough, in a lot of places he was. So it's like, for the last 20 years, I keep saying to myself, at some point, you can't argue purely on, for our sakes as Jews, you should do this. It's not nice to us. You're being mean to us. You're judging us incredibly harshly. Unbelievably harsh judgments on Israel and so on, based on really faulty information. But we're not going to win that argument. I kept thinking, at some point, they're going to realize that they're screwing themselves.
I don't think so. I mean, it's insane. I mean, I was, again, just to bring another example I have from today, and this was Andrew Pessin tipped me off to this one. There was at the University of California, the students, these called Bears for Palestine,
Right.
They wrote up. They were talking. They were defending Razmi Oden, fine, whatever, like that. But then they also said, why they think that, people saying that Lila Khaled and Fatima Bernawi are terrorists, and they said, no, they're not. And they said, they were demonstrating a strategic means of resisting occupation. Let me put it back on the screen. Of resisting occupation, but they're labeled as terrorists. It is only natural that Palestinians would militarize and resist the occupation. And then they called them protests. Bernawi again was she planted a bomb in a cinema in Jerusalem in like 1968 or something like that. But this is a protest, so what they're calling. So, and I pointed out, it's like everything they just did to justify Palestinian terrorism also justifies 9/11. It justifies ISIS beheadings. It justifies everything, and this is the normal discourse in college campuses, that you're allowed to say something that could justify anybody murdering anybody for any reason, including killing the dean because the books cost too much. Because really, there's no difference fundamentally of saying, "Hey, I'm being oppressed because the books cost too much. I'm allowed to do that." It's just a protest. And
It's unbelievable. In my book on the chapter on Jenin, I start out with an anecdote of coming to the office one day in the winter of 2002, so before Jenin, which was April. One of my colleagues with whom I normally stopped and talked on my way to my office said to me, "What's wrong? You look terrible." I said, "Well, I think there have been 3 suicide bombings that week."
Sure.
I said, "It's all these suicide terror attacks." And he sighed and said, "Yeah, what choice do they have?" And it's not like this guy was up on the Middle East or stuff. We never talked about that. He was an intellectual historian of America. He had nothing to do with the Middle East. I don't think we had ever talked about it. Mm-hmm. But what I heard in his voice was that this was something he had heard other people say. This wasn't his idea. He had heard other people say it, and as a result of the fact that when other people said it, everybody sort of nodded sagely. Mm-hmm. Well, I think the Israelis give them no choice. He just thought that, sort of like Hind Hudari, that this was perfectly normal. This was a perfectly acceptable response. And I thought about it. I wrote an essay about it. I sent it to him. He wasn't really interested, but it gave me the definition for what I call astounding stupidities. Each of my chapters has a series of astounding stupidities that were uttered in the course of the events in question. And this one was the first of them. What choice do they have? And an astounding stupidity I define as something that is empirically and or morally absurd. That's one criterion. And the second criterion is, and when you say it, everybody goes, uh-huh.
Right. And it's also, the fact is, only certain people you can say that about, that what choice do they have? You're not going to say that New Yorkers don't have any choice but to start killing Muslims after 9/11. Obviously not. It's, only certain people have that inherently part, and it's such a, it's so demeaning and it's so anti-Muslim, to be able to say that is what racism is. That's what Islamophobia, if such a word exists, is like these people hate Muslims so much to say, oh, they're not even smart enough to be able to think of any other way of getting out of this.
Right. And Manfred Gerstenfeld coined an excellent term for it, humanitarian racism, which is, these people are not capable of making moral choices. They're not capable of controlling themselves. If Sharon goes to the Temple Mount, they have to riot. They have to start beating up journalists and killing people. Of course. What else are they going to do?
And it goes beyond that, though, because, and this is something also a string of things I've seen over history, and I found it back in the 19th century, is that there's a Western fear of the other. And and the Muslims picked up on that, and they'll say, "Oh, we can go crazy, and our threat of going crazy is going to get the Westerners to do what we want them to do." And I saw this back again. It was really remarkable. I think it was like 1880s or something like that. There was these fearful articles in American newspapers saying I forget, the red flag of Islam is about to be unfurled in Constantinople, and that's going to mean a huge holy war, and everything's going to go crazy, and we really have to do everything we can to stop it. And I don't know what this red flag is. Supposedly there's some flag somewhere in Turkey. I don't know, but it's like, and there were, and it was like, but the same fear is like, and they use it all the time. And they're saying, how many times did we hear, oh, if we, if the U.S. moves the embassy to Jerusalem, it's going to be crazy. Exactly. Everyone's going to go nuts. And there are enough cases of that, like the cartoon, the Muhammad cartoons, that can justify it. Once every 10 years, they will kill somebody for some stupid reason. And that's what keeps it going.
So I call that proleptic dimitude. Which is, proleptic means anticipatory. So we behave like dhimmis even before we've been conquered. And the role, I mean, the way I explain to myself the unbelievably stupid behavior of Westerners in appeasing radical Muslims, in accepting organizations like CARE as mainstream moderate Muslims, rather than identifying them as the sort of cognitive war associates of the jihadis and so on. It's because the job of, historically, throughout the history of Islam as a majoritarian or as the dominant religion, it's the job of the dhimmi leaders to make sure that their communities, Jewish and Christian, and in India, Hindu and Zoroastrian in Iran, their communities do not insult or offend Muslims. That's the first and foremost job of the dhimmi leaders. And that's exactly how our leaders have behaved. And that's why a term like Islamophobia, which actually is much closer to what the Livingston formula, which is, anything that you say that's critical of Islam is immediately called Islamophobia, as opposed to everything you say about Zionism is immediately anti-Semitism. A word like that, which is really insubstantial in the extreme, a word like that can silence all the officials, the police, the school superintendents, the teachers, the parents, the social workers, the city councilors in a city like Rotherham for over a decade, allowing Pakistani Muslim men to systematically turn infidel British girls into sex slaves, and nobody wanted to say anything because they were afraid that if they said so, they would lose their jobs because they'd be called Islamophobic.
And that's certainly true, and that's probably, to an extent, one of the reasons you're having a hard time getting this book published.
Exactly.
Is that any publisher is going to be suffering from the stain of Islamophobia because you're going to say, here it is as it is, and I'm giving you lots of examples, and I have all the proof, and I got, and I got historic, I got everything for you, but that's not enough because they're afraid.
Yeah, right. It's the power, and this is what happened to Andrew Pessin at Connecticut College. And by the way, I have a book that just came out on the Pessin affair called Salem on the Thames, which is the river that runs through New London. What happened to him was the power of public shaming. John Ronson wrote an excellent book, You've Been Publicly Shamed. And that's what happened. And once that happens, here's Andrew Pessin. He's been an upstanding and outstanding member of a tiny community of 200 professors. And with the exception of we're on the verge of retirement, everybody signed petitions against him without ever consulting with him to see what he meant by the statement that they were condemning as hate speech, which was actually, to get back to the point about David Cook, a statement denouncing the hate speech and the hate mentality of Hamas.
Exactly. And that was, and again, we really are going to have to wrap up because this is going, far longer than I expected, but I'm having a lot of fun. I'm enjoying it. I can talk to you forever. But to me, and I've mentioned this before in my speeches, is that I think that the weapon that we have, since shame is such a great weapon from their perspective, and it works so, the only weapon we have against the Islamists and against these, Islamic, radicalists and supremacists is shame. And
Right.
that's, being able to show, hey, because they pretend that they have the most moral society. And when you say,
Right.
and when Westerners can say, no, it's not.
Right.
Here,
Right.
this is really, we have the more moral society. You guys don't measure up. That kills them. That drives them nuts. And they try to change the subject or anything like that. And when you allow them to change the subject, then you allow them to not even face their own shortcomings.
Right. And I'd like to point out one element to this that's really important and which I think has plagued the Israeli, pro Israel community, but also plagued the sort of Western community, and that is that people don't speak up. And the really important thing is when somebody actually speaks up and says, wait a minute, something's crazy is going on here, like against Linda Sarsour or something, and they get accused of Islamophobia, or they get accused of racism, or they get accused of whatever the latest fad is.
Mm-hmm.
People have to say, no, you can't use that language. No, that's an inappropriate response.
Right.
You've got to address what's being said here rather than hide behind a bunch of smears. And I think that this will only really change when people start speaking out, the silent majority. I hope it's the majority. I mean, I remember Dershowitz at one point, shortly after, in the early aughts, complaining that he'd try and speak to professors who were Jewish professors in Middle Eastern studies, and say, why aren't you speaking out about the kinds of stuff that's being said about Israel? And they'd say, well, it's my subject. I have to stay impartial. I can't be seen taking sides. Of course, the other side had no problem taking sides. And then he'd go to the other Jewish professors and say, why don't you say something? Well, it's not my field. And the fact is that, I was one of the people who spoke out, and I basically made myself persona non grata. Nobody wanted to hear what I had to say, and nobody backed me.
Yeah. And that's a fundamental problem. It's not only on campus, it's everywhere, and it's
everywhere.
it's scary.
And so everywhere people need to start talking back. People need to say, wait, when they hear somebody say that's Islamophobic, they need to say, can you tell me what you mean by Islamophobic?
Sure, absolutely. There's because it's anything that would piss off the Muslims is
Have we
Islamophobic.
lost you? Me?
Did you hear me? Sorry. Can you hear me? Did I lose you? Hello? Looks like it's gone. Can you hear me? Nothing? I lost you?
You there?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. That's I don't know if I can edit that out anymore. Sorry about that. Yeah, this is getting, for some reason we're losing your connection. I lost you altogether. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to end this then. Thanks very much. Sorry for the ending of this, but at the moment, this is it for now. I'm Elder of Zion, and thanks a lot for listening to me and Richard.